quality, and sustainability. The four priority areas that have been essentially outlined include taking action to strengthen disaster resilience and response, taking action to ensure debt sustainability for low-income countries, mobilizing finance for just energy transition, and of course, harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development. Now, this fourth pillar of South Africa's G20 presidency, in terms of some of the outlined priorities, falls squarely into the focus of this dialogue, co-hosted by the Institute for Global Dialogue and, of course, Insight 21. Now, within that, we know that even the T20 South Africa has seen the issue of critical minerals as a cross-cutting area of importance, touching on the various task forces that have been established. Example, Task Force 5, which is on accelerating climate action and the just energy transition. And the way in which the T20 has organized itself has it set aside five essentially task forces which look at different areas, including trade and investment, digital transformation, financing for sustainable development, solidarity for the achievement of the SDGs, and accelerating climate action and the just energy transition. Now, what I wanted to do before handing back over is to just read a little bit from the communique that was adopted at the midterm conference of the T20, which was under Task Force 5, although we see critical minerals, of course, as cutting across the different task forces. So issues like trade and investment, issues like digital transformation, it's absolutely touches on the importance of critical minerals. But one of the recommendations of the T20 communique states as follows: promote value addition and fair benefit sharing in critical mineral value chains for equitable green industrialization. Says the G20 critical minerals governance framework currently being developed should promote value addition and fair benefit sharing in critical mineral value chains for equitable green industrialization. It should mandate the appropriate ex-ante consideration of social and environmental impacts and safeguards and their monitoring throughout the life cycle of critical minerals. The G20 should promote the negotiation of balanced regional rather than bilateral agreements to reduce risks, broaden benefits, and enhance equity and accountability. In addition, partnership agreements related to critical minerals should be made publicly available. The G20 should endorse a credible global mining standard, building on existing initiatives, and help capacitate producer countries to capture value from their mineral endowments, as well as for implementation and monitoring. So this is just one of the recommendations that the T20 handed over to the Sherpa track during the third Sherpa meeting earlier this year. And we think this is important because over the past 2 decades, Latin America and Africa have become key regions in the global supply chains of critical minerals for the energy transition. And in this context, you find many actors with an interest in these particular regions. Actors like China, actors like the United States, like the European Union, but also even if you go to recent meetings like your South Korea Africa Summit, you see that the issue of critical minerals was quite key to the discussions. So both regions are certainly globally recognized as having large reserves of minerals that are essential for clean energy technologies such as batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicles. Africa, there's certain countries like the DRC, which are well endowed with cobalt resources, for instance, amongst others, lithium in Zimbabwe, and rare earths in South Africa and Namibia. And in Latin America, we've seen, of course, lithium found in the lithium triangle between Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, and copper in Peru and Chile, and nickel and lithium in Brazil. So it's quite key that our regions are quite vital to this. And I think for us as the Institute for Global Dialogue, we certainly welcome this opportunity to work with partners across our respective regions and building a bridge between Africa and Latin America, but also between South Africa and Argentina. And we look forward to this discussion, but also we look forward, I think, to the research and some of it collaboratively done following this side event going forward. So thank you very much, colleagues. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mthembu, for setting the scene for this conversation. Much appreciated for that. Clearly, there's a lot, to expand and discuss with colleagues to share light, on this very important subject. My name, colleagues, is Mikatek Sokupai, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, associated with UNISA. With me is a panel of expert presenters, speakers, on the topic, both from the Institute for Global Dialogue and from colleagues in Argentina, Universidad Siglo 21, and Universidad Nacional de Jujuy. I hope this is what I see in front of me, colleagues. Sanusha Naidu from Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue, associated with UNISA. We've got Dr. Stella Yuste, researcher at CONICET at Universidad Nacional de Jujuy. We've got Dr. Florencia Rubiolo, Director of Insight 21, Universidad Siglo 21 as well. Colleagues, you've heard, Dr. Mthembu spelling out, the scene, laying the scene, for this conversation. The endowments, that the Global South, the collective Global South has, and some of the risks that it potentially faces, and the challenges inherent with such endowments. We'll start with according to the list in front of me here, Ms. Naidu. If you could kindly take us through your first impression, your take on this challenge that is faced by the Global South in this area.
Thank you very much, Mika. Good day, everyone. Good day to the colleagues from Argentina. I'm not going to reiterate the names and of the institutions. I think it's been said already. I want to thank both the colleagues Stella and Florencia, but also I think for putting together this concept document and this T20 side event, which is very critical in light of how Palani has framed it. And I also want to thank Palani for actually opening up part of some of the issues that I will go into in this kind of framing of the issue of the context around the geopolitical architecture and critical minerals. Particularly because I think it plays such a pivotal role right now in terms of the global governance agenda, but more importantly, what constitutes consensus in this global governance agenda when it comes to critical minerals. So the framing that I've looked at in putting together, Mika, this kind of discussion that we're going to have today is more broad not necessarily honing in only on the G20, but looking at it from a kind of perspective of structural power and how structural power and the factors that link to structural power in terms of the issues that underpin the global context of critical minerals and why critical minerals has become such an important factor in the discussions, both in terms of trade and investment and in the five kind of thematic frameworks that the T20 has, which is around trade and investment, digital transformation, issues of the just energy transition, Agenda 2030, the SDGs, but also in terms of the financing for development issues, because it's really playing that pivotal role and this kind of push and pull that links up to this. So in looking at the architecture, I think it's very important for me, I use the framing of Susan Strange's structural power around the four pillars of structural power, which is security, production, finance, and knowledge. And when we look at the critical minerals architecture from that kind of push and pull perspective of the geopolitical architecture, I think it becomes very relevant for us to understand what the critical minerals debate is about, but more importantly, what is the policy dimensions and the policy realm of this critical minerals architecture in terms of the actors, in terms of the policy positioning, but in terms of what it is that we are thinking about in the architecture of a global governance agenda. So if we take, for example, the issue of the resources and how the resources link to security, how the resources link to supply chains, that in itself is both in terms of the disruption that can be caused in terms of using critical minerals as a much more geopolitical space in order to politicize relations and enhance geopolitical rivalry, both in terms of the maritime security architecture, but also in terms of peace and security architecture. And you're seeing this in the context of Africa, and we're very much looking forward to the impressions that our colleagues from Argentina give us in terms of where this is now in the context of Latin America. But it can be both a disruption, but also in terms of the peace and security architecture. So you're seeing the securitization of this critical minerals sector in terms of the geopolitical rivalry, whether you think about it in terms of access to markets or you think about it in terms of using it in the context of how do you define the peace and security agenda. Palani mentioned other actors in the sector in Africa, and I think we've got to also think about how this critical minerals also fuels a military-industrial complex. The second point is the domination of the production space, which is the second pillar of Susan Strange's architecture. You know, who's dominating both the refining and the processing space? And in terms of that, these vulnerabilities that create dependency as well in terms of the resource concentration and the supply chain is that this is now being looked at in terms of how does this link up to the finance and the technology space. In other words, what are some of the competition and fragmentation around the beneficiation architecture, and where is this coming in terms of who's dominating the market, whether it's being used in terms of their own kind of production spaces, moving into AI and other kind of digital transformation in terms of the value chain and so forth. The third issue linked to this issue, to the question of domination, is how do you access capital in this space? Where is the capital coming in order to finance some of the issues that we have in the geopolitical context of critical minerals in terms of moving up the value chain? I know we're speaking about the just energy transition, and that's another big debate about the financing for development questions, but it's also about where does the money come from for beneficiation? Do we understand what beneficiation means? Do we only want to beneficiate one part of the critical minerals value chain? So what is it that we're speaking about in terms of the beneficiation, but how does that impact on the financing questions? And then, of course, this again becomes part of, you know, what kind of investments are we seeing? Are there some kind of limitations on whether the investment is coming in the context of the finance and technology, but also in the context of the question around, do we have the money? Is the investments in terms of the UN Trade and Investment Conference on Trade and Investment, or the FDI reports that have come out recently, are we seeing that investment in terms of this competition and fragmentation around financing and the technology, and of course the intellectual properties that underpin this? The final point in this push factors, which is linked to the competition and fragmentation, is this question of a global regime for critical minerals around power competition to dominate the sector. You see these competing frameworks. You've got a fragmentation around this. Very early on we saw global compacts like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, state-led. We're seeing this issue coming back to the fore in the G20. But again, whether it's a US-led mineral security partnership, or whether it's how China is moving with the Belt and Road Initiative, the question is, in Africa, how are we dealing with this fragmentation around the governance, the absence of something much more durable and tangible, and how is it enforceable? And this comes back to this question of consensus around what do we want to create, what is it that we want to look at. Now, the kind of pull factors is how are the pressures of the fragmentation and competition and the kind of challenges that are in the critical mineral sector globally from a geopolitical perspective, how is it pushing countries towards some level of cooperation and integration? And that means that there's a level of interdependency. For example, no single state controls the full value supply chain from the extraction to the refining, in terms of whether you're talking about a battery or electric vehicle production. So there may be that level of cooperation that needs to be fostered despite the rivalries. The second issue is really around the title of this discussion today is around the Global South and its agencies. How do countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia that are resource rich are seeking to leverage some of their critical mineral deposits for industrialization? How this may create new partnerships? What kind of South-South cooperation are we looking at? And this kind of demand for fairer value distribution. Again, the challenges will be here. How do you overcome things like export controls that create certain restrictions on particular value-added production? So, as we talk about a Global South agency, also thinking about that this competition and fragmentation is not only in a relationship between the Global North and the Global South, but also within the Global South itself. Then, of course, is this question of climate change, climate goals. How do we talk about this level of just energy transition? Is it just about what is renewable energy? Are we moving more towards that kind of looking at the levels at which decarbonization creates a baseline for coordinated access to minerals, technology transfer, and sustainable standards? We're not very far from Agenda 2030, and these are big issues around climate change. The environmental question around the critical minerals is not just about economics. It's also about lives and livelihoods. It's about issues with regard to climate refugees. It's about how states are essentially domesticating some of this in their climate change bills, legislation, and so forth. And then the final point, I think, to make on this this kind of shift or pressure towards cooperation and integration is where do the mediation mechanisms lie? What are the global governance mediation mechanisms? Now, we talk about the G20, and it's very important to think about the G20 going forward. My one caveat to the G20 is that the G20 also has to deal with what is its development paradigm going forward. This linkage between the Sherpa track and the finance track. The finance track seems to be very much linked to a kind of monetary policy issues around how the economy needs to conform to a kind of interpretation of the global economic architecture based on mitigating risks around inflation, reducing monetary policy, inflation, etc. Questions. But there's also this issue around the consensus in the G20. And then the other issue is the G20 is only 20 countries. And perhaps, and let's not forget the regional blocs like the EU and the African Union. And this means that there has to be that level of consensus. And I think one of the bigger discussions in the G20 is the role of the multilateral development banks. What role can they play in this kind of provision, consensus, investment coordination, and setting the standards around environmental, sustainable development engagements, etc. And what other platforms can be used outside of just the G20, or you may have what you call this internal mechanisms in the G20 that could be leveraged in terms of this. So some of the key takeaways, Chair, from this discussion around the overview is really this question of the geopolitics of critical minerals. You know, as we try to understand it between the push and pull struggle between fragmentation and cooperation. The use of structural power as a lens to show that minerals are not just about raw resources. They reflect a deeper set of discussions around security, production chains, financial flows, and technological standards. And of course, the current kind of dimensions around what we're seeing in the global architecture is where you have major powers from both the global south and the global north, both in producers, but also as purveyors of critical minerals, contesting a space in terms of how they're going to influence what needs to be a critical minerals kind of compact and how this needs to go forward. And I think the recommendations around what South Africa produces in terms of its lens in the Critical Minerals Commission or the Critical Minerals Reflection will be one of those issues in terms of what goes forward. So I'll stop here, Chair. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Sanusha, for that detailed, very content heavy intervention. Quite a lot of issues, colleagues, to discuss. I will give next Dr. Stella Juste to give us a on these matters.
Thank you, Mika, and thank you, Professor Sanusha, for such an interesting and complete introduction. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Let me share first my screen, if I can. Can you see my screen right now?
Yeah.
Perfect. Let me just, I wanted to share my full screen. There, thanks.
There we go.
The Global South in the energy transition, the role of the G20 in the geopolitical governance of critical minerals, the role of the G20, of course. This work is the result of a joint effort between Professor Florencia Rubiolo and myself. And with these presentations, we want to reflect on the challenges and opportunities that the global South faces in the framework of the energy transition and, of course, in the context of the geopolitical competition. I would like to say that this presentation is based on an original research manuscript that it is currently under evaluation in an international journal for publication. So to guide you through our presentation, let me briefly introduce the structure of our presentation today. We will start by framing the global context of the energy transition, and then we will move on to analyze the dynamics of international competition around critical minerals, and then the way in which both regions, Africa and Latin America, with their resources and constraints, are inserted into this global scenario. And finally, we will discuss the potential role of the G20 as a broker, but also as a platform for cooperation. So let me see. Okay, then we will start by saying that in the context of the global energy transition, as we know, the fight against the climate change has, of course, accelerated the search for clean and for sustainable sources of energy, which entails, of course, a profound transformation in patterns of production, but also in patterns of consumption. So what we see is like three progressive scenarios. In the first scenario, what we see is a shift, of course, from fossil fuels to renewables, particularly to solar and wind energy, but also in electric mobility. And this shift is, of course, essential for tackling climate change and improving environmental quality. On the second scenario, what we are seeing is that the electric vehicle industry has emerged as a key driver of the global demand for critical minerals. Since the transport sectors account roughly the 55% of global CO2 emissions, the electrification of mobility is central to achieving climate goals. Also, EVs represent less than 1% of the global passenger car fleet today. There are some projections that indicate that by 2040, they will account for more than the 31%. So this rapid expansion in reshaping global change, with China, of course, holding a dominant position by producing more than the 70% of the world EV batteries. So this led us to the third scenario, where according to the International Energy Agency, the global energy transition will trigger an unprecedented surge in demand for critical minerals. Lithium, for example, the lithium demand is projected to increase fivefold by 2040, while graphite and nickel are expected to double. The demand for cobalt, for example, and rare earth elements is also set to rise sharply between the 50 and the 60%, and copper will grow by an additional 30%. So these trends highlight the central role of mineral supply in enabling renewable technologies and electrification worldwide. So let's talk about the context of global competition for critical minerals. On this slide, we can see how global competition is shaping the critical minerals landscape. The competition between China and the US is, of course, at the center of this dynamic. China dominates in solar panel and battery manufacturing, but yet is highly dependent on imported lithium and other raw materials. In response, the US is working right now on reduce its dependency on China by investing in domestic mining and refining capacities. In this context, trade tensions such as the US tariff on Chinese solar products are a clear example of how this competition plays out. Also, we can say that at the same time, Europe, as Professor Sanusha said, play a secondary but an important role. As you may know, since 2011, the European Union has published a critical raw materials list to identify minerals essential for its economy. However, the EU faces yet strong dependency on a few suppliers. For instance, it relies on China for heavy rare earth elements. So to address this vulnerability, Europe is implementing diversification strategies with both regions, Africa and Latin America, emerging right now as a crucial partners in securing stable mineral supplies. So in this context, Latin America and Africa are in the center of this issue. Lithium triangle, this zone formed by Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, and cobalt, for example, in the DRC, are geopolitical hotspots. But at the same time, both regions face a dual reality. On one hand, we can say that strong pressures stemming for great power competition, and on the other hand, new opportunities to attract investment and to increase their bargaining power in global supply chains. So this led us to talk about endowments, constraints, and strategic response in both of our regions. So as you can see, this slide compares Africa and Latin America in terms of resource endowments, constraints, but also in terms of strategic responses in this context of global competition. So in terms of resource endowments, we can say that Africa falls near the 30% of the world mineral reserves. It is especially dominant in cobalt, chromium, and platinum group minerals, while also possessing significant lithium, manganese, graphite, rare earths, and copper. In Latin America, in turn, as we already said, the region is home to the lithium triangle, this zone formed by Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, which accounts more than the half of the lithium global reserves. And also the region leads in copper production through Chile and Peru, while Brazil contributes with important deposits of nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare earths too. Yet, despite these vast resources, both regions face some structural challenges. Africa is often described as experiencing a resource curse, right? With weak infrastructure, with fragile institutions, corruption, and high dependence on external power. And also with social problems such as child labor, informality, and environmental degradation further complicate the picture. But when we see Latin America, the picture is not so different to that. Our region struggles with a legacy of extractivism, now so-called neo-extractivism, and export dependence. The governance fragmentation adds some complexity to this scenario, because perhaps, as you may know, Bolivia and Chile pursue stronger state control, while Argentina, for example, allows provincial authorities to manage their own natural resources. So we have in the same regions different models of natural resource management, right? And also we can add some domestic conflicts around environmental impact and debates over the development models that limit the region's ability to fully benefit from its mineral wealth. And I will also like to introduce Professor Florencia, that she will tell you about the strategic responses in this context.
Okay,
Go for
shall
it.
Mika, shall I just continue?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Thank you, Stella.
Proceed. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Stella. And of course, thank you, IGD and Pilani, for this opportunity to present this side event together with the T20. And well, just to pick up from where Stella left, there are strategic responses, we could say, from both territories, Africa and Latin America. They are different in some senses and they are similar in others. We could say that Africa is having an active non-alignment approach to this geopolitical competition, reflecting on critical minerals, which means that the countries are mostly not fully aligning with the US or China, but leveraging rivalry to attract investment, infrastructure, and to gain some negotiation room. And there are also, maybe we could say this is a difference from the Latin American region, which is that Africa is having some clear regional initiatives, fostering regional cooperation, as an important space for Africa to improve its conditions of inclusion in the competition for critical minerals. Just to name two of them, one of them is the African Union's Agenda 2063, which includes strategic mining as part of a long-term development vision. And the other one is the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has a framework to strengthen regional cooperation and inclusion in global competition for critical minerals. In the case of Latin America, as already Stella mentioned, there is a move towards greater state control and local value creation in different countries in Latin America. There are multi-level responses given the differences in domestic structures, particularly in Argentina. And in terms of regional approaches, we can see there is a much more fragmented scenario. The general trend is that Argentina, for example, as Stella mentioned, has a federal system in which provinces own and manage natural resources, which limits the national government capacity to nationally coordinate strategies. The mining provinces negotiate directly with foreign firms, which is different from the cases in Chile and Bolivia, for example. But we can see there are initiatives for local processing, for example, lithium carbonate and hydroxide, and pilot lithium battery plants through public-private partnerships. Bolivia, fully different case, has a full state control of lithium, for example, through the state-owned enterprise called YLB, Yacimientos de Litio Bolivianos. I'm sorry, I said it in Spanish. There is a public ownership of resources with a few partnerships with foreign firms. The only example is the agreement with the Chinese cattle brand CMOC Group for local processing and tech transfer in the case of Bolivia. Chile is a case in point in terms of critical minerals in Latin America. It is the only country that has a national lithium strategy, which was launched in 2023, which is state-controlled model with public-private partnerships, and Codelco, the state enterprise with a state majority partnership, leads this strategy of exploration and exploitation of lithium and copper with international enterprises. And in the case of Brazil, which is not in the lithium triangle, but it has a very diversified research strategy. Of course, Brazil has rare earth, copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, so it has a very diversified raw material endowment. And it has also launched a national policy on strategic minerals in 2022. It aims to attract investment under controlled conditions. So overall, we can see a pattern in Latin America with stronger state initiatives and public-private partnerships seeking to add value on this chain or on this sector on critical minerals, but there is a lack of regional coordination. Both regions are facing structurally constraints. Still, many raw material suppliers, they are pressured by global powers and they are seeking greater agency, but with limited success, which what we can see in our study is that there is no substantial reconfiguration yet of the Global South traditional role as a raw material supplier, both for Africa and for Latin America. And moving on, maybe on the more Latin American focus, we can mention three. I'm sorry, I'm waiting for, there we go. There we can see three patterns, we could say, regarding particularly China and the geopolitical competition. The first one is that in the case of Latin America, Chinese presence is much more recent than in other regions in the world. It entered Latin America in the early 2000s, driven primarily by its demand for raw materials, especially agricultural products, but also minerals and crude oil, and is a relatively new actor in the region compared to some traditional actors like the United States and Western Europe. And it has some characteristic, the relationship between China and Latin America, that is emulating some models that China is already implemented or had already implemented with other regions. A case in point here is Africa. With China has a multilateral relation with the African continent through the Forum on China and Africa Cooperation, and it has been a model for the China CELAC Forum. While the FOCAC was founded in 2000 with Africa, China CELAC Forum was first announced in 2014, and it is an emulating type of relation with the African model. So we can say that in this regard, Africa is kind of becoming an example of how China can enlarge or project its presence in the Global South regions. A second trend is that critical minerals is just one of the pillars of China's influence in the region. While China maintains a very central role, of course, for Latin America, but it still remains a secondary partner in terms of FDI, foreign direct investment, in which the United States and the European Union continue to lead. Beijing, on the other hand, has become a major loan provider, particularly for energy and connectivity infrastructure projects in Latin America, even surpassing the Inter-American Development Bank for the region, and of course, for South America, not for the whole Latin America. I'm excluding Mexico here, but for South America, it has consolidated its position as the region leading trade partner, main trade partner. And the third one is the great power competition. We suggest that is particularly evident in the critical mineral sector in the region. It's not the case of the agricultural sector, for example, but it is the case in the case of the critical mineral sectors in Latin America, especially in investments, because besides China does not have a strong participation in investments in other sectors, it does in the sector of critical minerals, particularly in lithium in Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina, with mining projects that are totaling $3.2 billion in 2025, with 7 developed lithium projects in the lithium triangle. Some of the, or maybe the main state-owned enterprises operating here are Ganfeng Lithium, Tianqi Lithium, particularly in Chile, also Xinjiang in South America and Argentina, and the CBC Consortium in Bolivia. So we can see that critical minerals is a field where the geopolitical interests are playing a key role in South American scenario. And finally, we wanted to maybe suggest or some recommendations of possible role for the G20, but also some questions just in line with what Sanusha said, right? First, we need to acknowledge that there are several precedents in G20 resolutions regarding critical minerals. The most recent one, just to name one, is the G20 Critical Minerals Framework draft, which was presented in May this year, and which aims to establish some guiding principles for securing inclusive and sustainable critical mineral value chains within G20 countries. So we want to say that it is recognized that the G20 has already had some role in trying to consolidate, or at least to put up a framework to discussing a critical minerals topic within the multilateral dialogue platform. But there are some recommendations we think this could be discussed maybe later in the Q&A part also, but some of them are that the G20 could become a real platform for agenda setting, which means that recognizing there are significant differences between critical mineral producing countries and consumers. These differences are due to asymmetrical interests, capacities, and priorities, mostly around development and energy security. The G20 could serve as a platform to bridge these divides, setting concrete agendas, fostering dialogue, and promoting fair and balanced processes of exploration, extraction, and trade. And in doing so, it can elevate Global South priorities within the global agenda. The second one is for the G20 to consolidate itself as a standard setting and regulation forum. Building on existing documents, of course, and initiatives, the G20 could position itself as a leading forum for standard setting in the sector, which could include promoting and incentivizing shared environmental, labor, and governance standards for critical mineral extraction. A third one, I'm sorry, I'm going very fast, but I just don't want to go so away from the time setting we proposed. So the third one could be the G20 could be proposing financing and technology transfer mechanisms that can actually work as platforms for developing countries mainly. The G20 should push for funding mechanisms that go beyond extraction, supporting infrastructure for value-added production and local industrial development, which is a main goal for developing countries. This could be by coordinated with multilateral banks that could channel resources into industrialization and technology transfer. And last one, another key role for the G20 is to promote inclusive and transparent supply chains through traceability systems, fair trade practices, inclusive governance, ensuring that producer countries are part of decision-making processes. This could help transform their role, I mean, the producer country's role, from simple providers of raw materials to co-shapers of global rules. And with this, I end my presentation and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Rubiolo. There are clearly a lot of issues. The endowment, the potential of the Global South in this space, especially in the space of future technologies, is clear. Colleagues, the role of the G20 is also there. But I would like to put it to all of you. Is the G20, first and foremost, in good shape, institutionally, to be able to, to play the role envisaged, in this space, to help, in, speeding up, the pursuit of development in the Global South using, its own, endowments. Another question, associated to this would be, there's the Arctic, and there's growing interest, in that particular region, for the minerals the endowments, that the region has as well, and even benefiting from the same climate, challenge that the world is facing: receding waters, receding ice, therefore exposing mineral endowments, especially rare earths, in that space, in addition to your gold, in addition to your oil and gas, in the particular region. That region as competition, potential competition, for instance, value chain. Another, issue to look at would be, especially for the African continent, you have this resource curse that many scholars and experts are concerned about on the continent. In fact, one of the challenges, and I noticed, I'm glad that you picked out the DRC for example. There's a serious concern in that area, especially in the eastern DRC. Regarding minerals, there, and the impact, that environment is having on local communities, and that sort of thing. Now, given that the G20 has been around for a while, right? G20 has been around for a while, and given its own shape, and against the backdrop, of what some may argue is a receding multilateralism. How do you see, the G20 navigating its way, out of potential challenges to help, in delivering, some of, these efforts, that you argue, could be looked into? And this question is for all of you, by the way. Maybe we'll start with the same, order, Sanusha.
Thanks, Mika. I think you've really created a nice provocative set of questions for us to engage in. And I want to thank Stella and Valencia for really giving us a bird's eye view into the Latin American architecture and ecosystem. And just a few points on that. I have the same question that you have. It's one that plagues my mind, Mika, about whether the G20 is the correct platform or is fit for purpose to deal with these issues at this point in time. Because I think to a large extent, a lot is being put onto the shoulders of the G20 as if it is a Harry Potter with a magic wand, and it can wish and wash and do everything it wants to deal with the issues of the global governance crisis that we are in, from the issue of trying to resolve the impasse around the global economic crisis, to issues of critical minerals, to questions of debt sustainability, to Agenda 2030. I mean, it's a massive smorgasbord of issues that is being put onto the agenda of the G20. And if we go back and we think about the G20 and we look at how the G20 has emerged, what has been the nature of which the G20 had become the G20, it's born out of crisis. So out of crisis, we are trying to say an institution of the G20, which is only 20 countries, which are supposed to be measured by a particular set of metrics, which are evolving all the time, and excluding certain actors, certain countries from the G20. We're saying they have this powerful agency to resolve this issue. So I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question. Like you, I'm not 100% certain that the G20 is the correct forum for this, for the critical minerals question. I think the challenge really comes with regard to the fragmentation of the global governance architecture and the agenda setting, and how you have to think about it at the regional level. So in the case of Africa, you've got to think about SADC, you've got to think about ECOWAS, you've got to think about how are they resolving these issues, and how this is permeating into aligning to the AU agenda on critical minerals. Because the real challenge for me of the G20 is that the G20 is the reflection of the contestation of the global system. It represents the crisis of the global system in many ways. The competing interests of actors, the competing power dynamics, the fragmentation. They are forced to cooperate, but cooperate on issues that are very much not going to deal with the real dynamics of what is the criteria. So I'm not sure whether if the G20 in its current iteration will remain in its current iteration going forward. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what it's going to be like. It depends, because the G20 also has to deal with a plethora of issues in terms of what the crisis is at the domestic level of countries in the G20 and how that will impact on the G20. So I think our first test of that is the incoming presidency of the US. Taking the chair of the G20. What will this G20 look like going forward? In relation to your second question around the Arctic, I think you've really raised a fundamental point about the Arctic. It's the ecosystem of the global governance challenge on critical minerals. It represents everything from the fragmentation to competition, to strategic interest, to maritime security issues, to ice caps that are melting, rising sea levels, environmental degradation, a developmental conundrum. Everything is happening in the Arctic. But at the same time, it's also linked to this idea that the policy of the Arctic and what's happening in terms of where new gas deposits are found, new energy deposits are found. It seems as if again, there is no single actor or platform that can deal with this. So again, the question I would have is this even a discussion in the G20 at this point in time? In that context. And then the other thing to just touch on a little bit when it comes to Latin America and Africa, which Stella and Florencia did such a great, interesting scoping on, is I think the point made about some of the sub-national issues in Latin America versus those issues in Africa, where in some of the case studies cited by Florencia, she spoke about it's not a national issue in terms of legislation, but it's about the provinces or the regions or the subnational issue. I think in Africa, my perception is, and I could be wrong, is that the critical minerals or the extractive industry is very much a national issue. It's very much about the central government and the control that the central government has over the natural resources and over the critical minerals. And we keep thinking about the DRC, but just have a look at Mozambique. And think about what's happening in Mozambique, where you have this uneven development or development that's completely fabricated. But the national government in Maputo has a problem because there's a sense of exclusion from people in Cabo Delgado not being part of the national question. But then the critical minerals is the resource paradox that you speak about, Mika. So I think to a large extent, that's interesting in terms of how resources in Africa are also linked to the kind of political dynamics that exist within the state. And then, of course, the impact that has both beyond at the border and behind the border, and the rise of different groups that then use the critical minerals in terms of their grievance politics and how that plays out as well. And I think the example of what happened in Nigeria with the Niger Delta is classic in that sense, in terms of how the exploitation of the resource curse becomes an economic challenge for countries in the continent in terms of the resource dependency, but also the question of the currency volatility, the Dutch disease in terms of currency question. So again, those issues around what will the G20 do, I don't think I have an answer, but I'm not sure if we are trying to ask the G20 to do what it hasn't been able to do in the context of its iteration. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sanusha. Professor Rubiolo and Professor Yusta, if you can come in before we go to questions from the floor. Please, your take on this. Responding either to Sanusha or some of the questions posed.
Yeah, I will be very brief because Sanusha already answered most of the questions, but also I was while she was speaking, I was thinking that it is true that G20 as a multilateral forum, which doesn't even have a formal articulation, has many limits and constraints to operate and to, of course, provide clear and concrete solutions on complex and emerging also, because these are also recent problems with which the G20 was not, we could say, launched for or created for. It did come out of a crisis, but that crisis did combine or did represent the different interests from developing countries and developed economies. Even when the G20 was formed, there was that, I would say, genesis at the beginning of the G20. But we can understand the G20 is not the maybe only platform or only level of discussion for the critical mineral problem and kind of complex dynamic. But I guess what we are trying to say is that it can't be absent in this discussion. It has to have a role. And the role has to be to push for the dialogue and to push for the solution. There has to be a model to follow, to look at. And if it's not the G20, of course it can be another one, but today, which could be the other one? So I guess that's a basic point here. It won't provide the answers, but it can't be answered absent of it. I guess that's what we were kind of we can say. I guess.
I would like to add some to what.
Thank you so much for the yeah. Go for it, Prof.
Thank you, Mika. I would just like to add something to what Florencia just said, that I think that when we think in terms of the G20 as a platform for dialogue and cooperation, I think that it is relevant to find the ways to incorporate also the local voices. I'm not sure about what's the context in Africa in this particular subject, but in Latin America, the experience of countries such as Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile has showed that local voices, particularly local governments, but also local communities, indigenous people, play a relevant role in terms of led to the local governments to create strategic planifications in terms of the relation with foreign investments in the places where the production plants of mining are located. And I think that this is important because local communities, indigenous people, are the ones who receive in the first time the impact of this mining production. So I think that perhaps one of the ways that we could think in the G20 as a platform of cooperation and dialogue, is incorporating and bringing the demands and the point of view of different local actors into this scenario of dialogue. That is what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that, Professor. We'll turn just quickly to a couple of hands that we saw on the floor. Professor Garth Lippier, had his hand up, and I think Dr. Leslie Masters as well would like to pose a question. Professor Lippier, do you want to ask?
Good day. I hope I can be heard, and thank you very much to the panelists for a very engaging and insightful discussion. I remain a little skeptical about the G20 as a broker, and I'm wondering if I may provoke the panelists here. I'm thinking, is there not strategic and geographic and conceptual space for forming a global South cartel on critical minerals? Modeled on OPEC, shall we say. Remember that the primary raison d'etre of OPEC was to maintain and promote national sovereignty over natural resources. And that entailed coordinating production levels, managing supply and demand, crucially influencing pricing, not leaving pricing to the vagaries of international markets, etc. And this pertains particularly to the four strategic sectors that one of the panelists mentioned: lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, rare earths, and copper. All these are located within the circuits of the global south. Now imagine if you had the kind of cartel that is not, meant to control competition, but essentially its purpose would be normative, to ensure the supply of a global public good, but ensuring also, that there is equity, justice, and fairness in the supply of critical minerals. So just a provocative thought for your panel. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. We'll ask Dr. Leslie Masters as well before you respond to this, and then we'll take questions from the chat platform as well. Dr. Masters?
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to engage with the panel. And thank you for the presentations. I think it's an important discussion to be having. As with most things, the technology, and we're talking about EVs and the response to climate change, the technology is in advance of the politics, and the politics is playing catch up when it comes to governance. But I think there are other initiatives like Prof. Lepere was talking about around OPEC and extractive industries and resource sovereignty that we can learn from. And one of the questions that I posed was, I mean, we have things that exist like OPEC. We have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. These are not new. They've been around for a while, and yet there's still challenges around compliance. There is still challenges around getting companies or countries on board. And it doesn't matter if it's a north-south divide, there's division between south-south. And questions around sovereignty of Africa's resources and African countries when it comes to China or to India. So I think it's going to be a very nuanced discussion that needs to be had around governance. I think I agree that perhaps the G20 is not necessarily the best platform for this, but important platform to be having these discussions, because it is these countries that are going to be driving the economy of extractive minerals. So yes, important, but perhaps not the final word. But then the question becomes, if not the G20, then what? Where else should this be going? And thinking about these other forms of governance, when looking at other opportunities, when we come to things like managing forests, managing other resources, how are countries managing their sovereignty, resource sovereignty, managing the governance of these within the country, whether that's through the corporates. This is a multi-layered, complex challenge. And this is where the problems come, because when it comes to global governance, it's at one level. We have states involved in discussing, but it's so much bigger than that. So you need a platform where you can have all these players present, because they all have that voice involved. So I think it's going to take a lot of discussion around and looking what's already in place, what is working, what is not working, why is it not working, how can we address this multi-layered problem that is confronting countries and will continue, I think, as the struggle becomes more advanced. The challenge is going to become greater. So this is a great place to have this discussion at the forefront of something that is becoming a really big issue to deal with in terms of governance. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Masters, for that intervention. Very, very important, solid contribution. Does the panel maybe want to respond to these two inputs quickly before we go to the chats? Should we start with, let's do it the other way around. Let's start with Professor Yusta, and then Professor Rubiola, and then Sanusha.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Mika. I was thinking about what just Leslie just said about the complexity of a multi-layer governance model, right? When we think, for instance, in Latin America, and as we mentioned with Florencia in our presentation, Latin America has its own complexity in terms of how the countries have created their own natural resources model of management, right? For example, as we mentioned, Chile and Bolivia have models where the states has a key role on the management of natural resources, and in Argentina, local powers are relevant in terms of decisions, and of course the Argentinian national constitutions allows to the local powers, particularly to the provinces, to manage their own natural resources. And these things like this add even more complexity when we think in terms of global governance, right? We have to take into account that the regions and that countries can have different ways or models of manage their own natural resources, and we have to, as Leslie said, we have to think in terms of multi-level governance. And I think that that is a complexity that must be bring into discussion in the context of the G20 or any other multilateral space of dialogue, right? That is just what I wanted to add.
Thank you so much. Professor Rubiola?
Yeah, following on Stella's answers, and maybe answering to one of the questions about the possibility of establishing a global South cartel on critical minerals. Well, that seems not only complex and probably conflictive, but also impossible to implement. In terms of, there is an example, I don't know if you are aware of a proposal in South America of a lithium OPEC. There was a proposal for that. It didn't turn out well, it didn't advance at all. There are many reasons for that. One of them is that what we already mentioned, there are different organizational structures within the South American countries which would oppose such an organization. For example, because the subnational governments would lose their autonomy in such an organization, right? So that's one of the obstacles probably. There is also at least within also South America, but I guess in Africa wouldn't be so different. There's also a multi-level competitive approach within the region, between the countries. We are seeing not only that the developed economies are competing for access for critical minerals, but also that developing nations which do have the critical minerals are competing to attract, for example, investments, infrastructure, buyers, etc. So I guess this would make it, besides, I personally, and I will leave that aside, but I don't believe the cartel on lithium, for example, would be a good idea to solve this problem or in any way. But there are also not only obstacles regarding the developed and developing nations here in terms of interests and goals, but there are also contradictions within the Global South and the producer countries. And so there's another table maybe to set up for dialogue. I guess that's not the G20 to do it for, probably. I don't know if it's the G77 or there's another platform for that. Also for Professor Masters, I think she was mentioning the possibility of a multi-actor dialogue, sitting everyone on the same table. There is an example also in Argentina of the lithium table, it is called like that, that sits together the national government, the subnational governments, enterprises, and the state enterprise. And it does function as a multi-actor forum. It hasn't had much, I would say, successes yet, but it could be kind of a small model for what Professor Masters was saying. I guess that in the global level, that would be much more difficult to achieve, given the asymmetries between some of the buyers and the producers, I believe. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that response, Prof. We've got, there's a quite a generous amount of questions in the chat group. So much interest in this. There's the first one, says China enjoys, I don't know, the initials IF. Doesn't see. I don't see what the name is, but it's initials IF. Says China enjoys a significant geopolitical influence on transition energy minerals because it entered the sector almost 50 years ago. And its overall approach differs from that of both the global south and the global north combined. What does the concept of criticality mean to the global south? Given that we lag in industrialization and manufacturing technology? I think that's a very important question. Another one, okay, it starts with also a longish narrative. Competition from Balingene, Kahombo. Competition for critical minerals has two adverse effects on weak countries. Armed conflicts, which is something that I tried to raise as well earlier, and a trend of colonialism in which a single country can be deprived of its sovereignty over its natural resources at the expense of national development. See the example of DRC, forced to release its minerals to the USA, allegedly against security in the context of endless conflicts since 3 decades. A deal which may be invalid under international law. Does the South-South cooperation have the potential to mitigate, such adverse effects or eradicate them? What can a country like the DRC expect from such cooperation? Another one, should we do maybe 4 before we consider another 4? Okay, 2 more. So Chiwofatso, Shane Koshane, or Shane Choshani, says, responding to Chiwofatso, says, I concur the critical mineral strategies of the countries in the north which dominate the G20. No, this is not a question, it's a statement. Question from, let's see, no, another statement. Francisca Fonse asks, thank you for such an interesting discussion. I also consider all bodies involved and whether the G20 is the most effective body. So something that was repeated earlier also by Dr. Masters. Maybe one last question before you respond. Let's see. Many of them are actually statements, some in support of what has been said, others adding new dimensions, to it as well. This last question: AU has the Natural Resource Governance Program, UNECA has industrialization programs and plans, and SADC has its industrialization plan for well over a decade. Has there been an evaluation of these programs per region or REX? But this is more SADC era, Africa, era, this particular question. But feel free to go for it. If if you want, the platform is yours, colleagues.
In any
Do you
particular
want to
order?
go for it first, Sanusha?
Okay, thank you.
No,
I think
in any order of the questions, anyone, whichever one you can pick and choose. Go for
I
it.
think
Yeah.
that the questions are kind of like linking to what Garth and Leslie have been asking about in terms of how do you move the needle on this, and the provocative recommendation by Garth about a cartel, I think is something that we have to think about, not necessarily in the way that we think about cartels, but think about it more from a response. So both Leslie and Garth's kind of comment question makes us think about the kind of frameworks we have in Africa and how do we need to make those frameworks much more enabled to do what it needs to do. Because it's one thing having the frameworks, but as I look at the questions and the comments, it coming back to what is the agency of these initiatives at the level of the continent, but also what is happening in terms of the regional bloc. And I think the challenge is really that the G20 cannot do what it can do because there are competing interests. Like everywhere else in terms of the critical minerals architecture and ecosystem, there are competing interests because countries that are sitting in the G20 have competing interests in the critical mineral spectrum. Countries that are not in the G20 also have competing interests in the critical mineral spectrum. So this idea that the G20 can become something other than what it is, I think perhaps the challenge is that how do we get it down to the regional level, to the continental regional level, and how does that then feed into the G20? Because if you can create a broad consensus among the AU members around the critical minerals and what has been raised in the chat box about African institutions, etc., and so forth, then of course you start moving the needle on what is the consensus. And I think we're never going to get the kind of consensus that we want in terms of completely ignoring national interests and the issue of countries that want to use national interest in terms of their own kind of power evolution and using it for their own kind of engagement around enabling them for power. But I think there are some broad strokes that can be done. It doesn't have to be left to the G20. And I think that's where we miss the mark, is that we kind of missing a brief in the middle and we're just jumping to the G20. The discussions in the G20 are important. I don't disagree. But I think you've got to come with some proposals that need to be taken to the G20, which can be debated in the G20. And you can't just think about the G20 as having that discussion, because I think what we are doing is that we are bypassing even those agencies in the UN that's supposed to deal with some of these issues. Now, if we are to think about critical minerals from a trade and investment perspective and from a perspective of international trade, you also have a serious dilemma, which we never spoke about, and that is the WTO. The dispute resolution mechanism in the WTO is completely disabled. So you can't bring a dispute, or you can bring a dispute rather, to the WTO, but it doesn't resolve the dispute because the dispute resolution mechanism is no longer valid because there's nobody to adjudicate. So if you think about the cases that some Southeast Asian countries have brought against each other in the Global South, which is what Florencia spoke about in terms of contradictions in the Global South, you can bring it to the WTO. But there's nothing to ventilate because you can say it's unfair liberal practice or unfair trade practice, whatever. But I think what we are beginning to see is more fragmentation of how regions need to start thinking about what is their critical minerals policy, what is the implementation strategy around critical minerals, and it's not going to be ventilated in the way that we want it in the G20. It has to happen within regions. And I think that's the challenge we have. Are we ready for that kind of plurilateralism that's happening at the back end of the G20? On the issues of whether or not we can think about the G20 going forward, I think it will remain there. It will be there. But I think about 2 weeks ago, there was a very interesting article about countries that are outliers to the G20. I can't remember where it was published, outliers to the G20, who are now wanting to form the kind of, I wouldn't say an alternative to the G20, but kind of like push away from the G20. So we're always going to have this. And so if we're only going to think about the G20, we've got to think about what are the outliers that are sitting on the outside of the G20 and how they are going to look at this. So this is why it's imperative, I think, for compacts frameworks in Africa and perhaps even in Latin America to start finding that common ground around how they want to deal with the critical minerals process. And there was one last question about what is it that we want to do on beneficiation. It's a big question for me because to my mind, beneficiation, if we understand the logic of how a mineral gets beneficiated, it goes through various technical specification processes. So it has to go through different levels of beneficiation. And that's what I'm not getting when I hear leaders talk about beneficiation in the critical mineral section. When you take a lithium out of the ground, it doesn't automatically transform through beneficiation into an EV battery. It has to go through specification. So we need industry actors in the room to explain to us that beneficiation is not just about getting into the supply chain of EV batteries. You may have to do 3 or 4 steps before that as part of your beneficiation. And that, I think, is something that we need to think about in this context. So I think the challenge for me is, let's think about how do we do it at home in terms of this debate and what critical mineral policy is and why we're not implementing what we have as compacts and frameworks in Africa before we start thinking that it can be ventilated only in the G20.
Fantastic stuff. Wow, thank you so much for that, Sanusha. Then I'm told that we have limited time left on the webinar. Perhaps do you want to do the last your last responses, Professor Rubiolo and Professor Euster? And
Yes.
may I try and put you on the spot and commit you? You see, there's several more questions on the platform. If maybe we can send them to you by email, and then maybe we can publish them as well, your responses to some of these questions, and then maybe continue the debate there as well. Please, but your last responses to the conversation.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Mika. And very shortly, and one more thing, I saw many of the assistants asking for a PowerPoint presentation. We can certainly send it to them, or you can send it to them if you wish, or we can give you our email addresses, and you can ask for it there also. There it's an open presentation, so there's no problem with that. And there, only very briefly, because Sanusha already touched on most points on the questions, and I agree with most of it, particularly with the regional perspective we need to approach the critical mineral topic. It is certainly one of the main challenges for our regions. I'm speaking mostly about South America. Maybe in Africa is similar to us, but there are. It's been very difficult for South American countries, even for very few countries such as Argentina, Brazil, and Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, which we share the lithium triangle, which is a very recognized, I would say, territory worldwide. It has been very difficult to sit on the same table and have dialogues regarding how to propose a common agenda for different multilateral forum. So I can imagine it would be probably an utopian to think that if the G20 suggests that, for example, the lithium triangle implements some kind of policy, and magically Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina will actually do it. So I agree with Sanusha that the first step, it would be to take a regional approach to this taking into account the different actors within that small region, maybe first, as the first stepping stone, I would say. And there was a question which I thought it was very, very interesting, which was what does the concept of criticality mean to the global south regarding critical minerals, I would think. And when I think about that, I think about our countries which are seeing lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel as kind of gold mines, I would say, like dollar mines in this case, like to pay the foreign debt, to invest in infrastructure, not only in energy infrastructure, but in health infrastructure, education infrastructure. It's a way of somehow improving social development. That's the criticality of this, I would say. It is much, I would say, material, much territorial, much closer to our population and to our communities than to a geopolitical competition or a multilateral forum. For the, I believe, the governments that are dealing with this critical mineral richness, it is an opportunity. Probably it is critical because it might be the opportunity to answer to some of the still pending demands on social needs, economic needs, health needs, and education needs within the population. So I think that's from a national perspective why it is so critical for those countries. And I would close with that. And thank you for this space and for this opportunity to share all the thoughts. It was really, really interesting.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, Prof, for your willingness to share your research with us, taking the time to discuss this important issue with ourselves, and all of the interested parties across the globe on this important matter. Thank you, much appreciated to you, Professor Yuste. Your last remarks as well before perhaps we close.
Thank you, Mika. I would like to add something to what Florencia said about the challenges of a regional approach to this phenomenon, right? In Latin America, we see the foreign investments in many countries and for many local governments or subnational governments, that the foreign investment sometimes is seen as an opportunity for developing, right? So one of the challenges that we have when we think in terms of regional approaches is that inside of each country, we face different tension between subnational level and the national level regarding not only of the model of management of the natural resources, but only in terms of investment. So for instance, for local governments or subnational governments in countries such as Argentina, the foreign investment is seen as an opportunity to diversify the local productive matrix and also to achieve and to be able to give answers to the need of health and education and to achieve different development goals. So sometimes we face even tensions between the local levels and the national levels that must be solved somehow before to think, I think, in terms of a regional approach, that I think that it will probably be even more complex when we think that the countries faces different or think in different models of how to deal with foreign investments and how to manage their own natural resources. Of course, I think that also the political alternances in Latin America, for instance, are already a challenge. Someone in the chat mentioned the role of China, for example, in the past decades in our region. I think that China is an example in how a foreign country has understood the internal political dynamics in Argentina. China used this multi-level strategy to establish different relations with national governments, but also with subnational governments, with universities, with local organizations, with indigenous peoples. And in that way, China has created this successful model of vinculation that when political alternatives arrive to the scenario of the country, this kind of relation that China has already established among other different actors allows it to make its initiatives to survive, right? So I think that it is very interesting to think in terms of a regional approach to this issue, but it's also a challenging, take into account the difference between all the countries of the regions and in terms of Global South also. So I would like to finish here. Thank you very much.
Wow. Oh, thank you so very much, Professor Houston. Much appreciated for this. This brings us to the conclusion of our conversation. Clearly, there's a lot to discuss, a lot to expand on. But we're limited in terms of the amount of time that we can do this for now. Doesn't mean it's the end. So there will be